There's a stigma going around right now of people saying that Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is the worst of the original tetralogy. That means 4, by the way. But I actually disagree. In fact, I believe that Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is probably the best FNAF game in the original 4 and doesn't deserve all the hate that it receives. Here's why. On July 23rd, 2015, Scott Cawthon released Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the game being a supposed prequel to the original Five Nights at Freddy's game. When creating Five Nights at Freddy's 2, Scott knew that he couldn't just copy and paste the same game, so he had to change it up somehow. He had to keep the mechanics generally the same, but he couldn't just make it exactly the same. He didn't want to lose his main audience, so how did he change it? He decided to remove the one thing that made the players feel safe: the doors. The removal of the mechanical doors was a turnoff for some people, and I can understand why. The doors in the first game were your only line of defense, and for some people, that was what embodied the first Five Nights at Freddy's. But the removal of the door allows the animatronics to get up close and personal with the player. After all, if you want to make a good sequel, you want to make it bigger and better, so putting the player right in front of the giant hunk of metal makes sense as the next logical step. The introduction of the mask is a perfect way to allow the animatronics to enter into the office while still granting you plenty of security. But if you can just put on the mask, then what's stopping you from just using it constantly? That's where Foxy and the Marionette come in. Withered Foxy and the Marionette are FNAF 2's FNAF 1 Foxy and Freddy. Just like in FNAF 1, the camera has few actual uses. The Marionette's wind-up music box keeps the player from keeping the mask on by requiring the player to take it off in order to open up the cameras. This, I feel, helps keep the game similar to FNAF 1's mechanics, where the player needs to check the cameras for Freddy and Foxy. This makes it so that way you don't just sit in the room looking left and right over and over again. But what about Withered Foxy? Withered Foxy adds an extra piece of difficulty by being in the hallway, requiring the player to use the flashlight. The flashlight battery adds an additional bit of difficulty, but not by much. The battery doesn't die very quickly and is only used for the main hallway. The vent lights don't actually use any battery, so the battery isn't usually a problem unless you are constantly using it. But if balanced right, that won't ever be a problem. These 4 mechanics caused many people to believe that the game is sloppily put together and that it's way too hard. But if anything, I believe that its structure requires you to do a sort of dance between each part. And in order to fully explain that, we're gonna have to talk about another game that I love: Dark Souls. I swear to God, this isn't a joke. Now please just hear me out. Dark Souls is one of my favorite games ever, and for a lot of people, it's the best game ever made. Am I just talking about Dark Souls because I really like Dark Souls? Definitely, but can I use it to explain how Five Nights at Freddy's 2's mechanics aren't badly designed, but actually a well thought out dance, and are surprisingly fair and balanced? Not really, but I'm doing it anyway. Dark Souls game mechanics consist of fighting enemies and defeating bosses, and it's known best for being a hard game. Some people argue that the game is unfair, but many videos online have proved that yes, it is hard, but it's not unfair nor impossible. Every boss fight has multiple openings for attacks, and dodge rolls make you invincible for about a second or two, requiring you to balance when to dodge, when to strike, and when to heal if necessary. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 does the exact same thing, requiring you to dance between using your camera, your mask, your lights, and rewinding the music box when necessary.
Both games require patience and strategy.
You don't get killed immediately for pulling up the cameras, and the game is designed where there is enough time to deal with the music box and Withered Foxy if managed correctly. Not only is it possible, but I argue that its difficulty is what makes Five Nights at Freddy's 2 so great. The idea of overcoming a difficult challenge is what drives people to do bigger and better things. Nobody would play video games if they were too easy, because that would get super boring. A good example of a difficult challenge is the Sans boss fight from Undertale. It's so unapologetically brutal and tries its hardest to trick you in every possible way. But because of its sheer difficulty, that's what makes it one of the most memorable boss fights in all of gaming history. Now, FNAF 2 is nowhere near as difficult as Dark Souls or the Sans boss fight from Undertale, but its additional mechanics make it hard enough that it isn't a cakewalk. I believe that FNAF 2's intentions were to be harder than the previous one, so that way previous players of the first Five Nights at Freddy's had some sense of challenge brought to the table. I don't feel that it deserves to be hated on it just because it's difficult.
I think that it should be applauded for it.
I don't think that FNAF 2 is meant to be played first, but that doesn't mean that it isn't possible to play it as your first FNAF game. In fact, it actually was what introduced me to Five Nights at Freddy's back in 2015. The simple to learn yet hard to master mechanics were what led me to watching other people play the game online, and even helped me find YouTubers like Markiplier and CoreyX Kenshin. FNAF 2, to me anyway, is the best iteration of the original 4 FNAF games, and I don't think that it deserves all the hate that it's received. FNAF 2 is the one FNAF game that I feel best teaches you to manage with what you have and to turn what seems like an impossible situation into a possible one. Its difficulty isn't what slows players down. I feel that it's the unwillingness to get back up and try again that does. Thanks for watching. This is all obviously my opinion and should be taken with a grain of salt.
It's also very short. I forgot to mention that part.
If you hate FNAF 2, that's actually fine, but I thought it would be an interesting topic to discuss, and who knows? Maybe I'll convince a few people to give it a second chance. That's all for now. Subscribe to join the flock if you feel like it. I'm going to go play Dark Souls now. Bye.